Hi everyone, my name is Zach Slagle. I'm a fisheries biologist with the Ohio Division of Wildlife, and I'm also the co-chair of the Forage Task Group for the Lake Erie Committee. Today I'm going to present to you information on our lower trophic trends and forage fishes in Lake Erie. The Forage Task Group is tasked with a variety of charges. We monitor lower trophic level trends across the lake. We monitor trends in forage fishes, both directly from our trawl surveys and also in terms of the diet and growth and condition of sport fishes. We also conduct hydroacoustic assessments, and we act as a point of contact for aquatic invasive species. Many of you are familiar with Lake Erie, but it's important to note that there are 3 different basins and that each basin has different trends in forage fish abundance as well as sport fish diet condition and growth and such like that. We'll be presenting trawl data from surveys that take place in each of these 3 basins and also survey that takes place in Long Point Bay in the East Basin. Today's talk is broken up into 5 parts, each dealing with part of those charges: lower trophic, trawl, diet, growth, and condition of sport fishes, hydroacoustic assessment, and aquatic invasive species. First, we're going to talk about lower trophic level trends in Lake Erie. So in 2020, because of the pandemic, not all agencies were able to get out and sample. So I'm only going to be presenting lower trophic level information from the stations that are circled, all in Ohio waters in the west and in the central basins. In order to monitor trophic status, the Forage Task Group uses trophic status indicators. So what these TSIs, are one single number that combines total phosphorus, chlorophyll A, and Secchi depth. And depending on where that TSI falls within a range, you can tell what trophic status it is. So for much of the lake, we're targeting mesotrophic conditions, which are a moderate level of nutrients that favors perkids. Here we're looking at trophic status index summaries for the West Basin for the entire time series. The green band here is representing mesotrophic values, while the yellow band up here is representing eutrophic values. For each year, we have a box and whisker plot. In the middle, these lines are indicating the median value for all of the samples from that year in the West Basin. And then we also have the interquartile range and 1.5 times the interquartile range in these lines up here. If you look for the last 5 years or so, we have a gradually increasing trend. We were mesotrophic back in 2016 and then gradually increasing well into around the middle level of eutrophic for 2020. For the Central Basin, we don't have as apparent of a trend for the last few years. You can see the Central Basin has been kind of floating around in the mesotrophic zone as far as TSI goes. In 2018, we actually hit eutrophic. And in 2020, as you can see here, the median value is just under eutrophic in mesotrophic. So we hit the target here. To summarize our targets and our actual measurements for the year 2020, in the West Basin, we're targeting mesotrophic conditions that favor perkids, but we're above that into eutrophic status for 2020. In the Central Basin, we did meet our target goal of mesotrophic, and again, in the east, nearshore, and offshore, we did not sample in 2020. We go to look at the last 5 years, as we do for the state of the lake. The trophic state index indicators for each of the basins. So up here in the yellow, we can see the West Basin was once in mesotrophic, but is now well into eutrophic, which is above target, and we have a gradually increasing trend. Whereas in the Central Basin, here in the middle, we've been bouncing around in the mesotrophic zone, but have been above it for a year or two in the past 5 years, and we do see a gradually increasing trend. Whereas over in the east nearshore and east offshore, they've kind of leveled off in the last few years and are well into oligotrophic conditions. Moving on to trends in forage fishes. First, we'll look at some trawl data from across the lake. The Forage Task Group data includes trawl surveys from 4 different portions of the lake. In the West Basin, we have a combined Ontario and Ohio interagency trawl. In the Central Basin, we're relying on Ohio data. In the East Basin, we have data from New York, and we also have Long Point Bay data from the East Basin from Ontario surveys. I'm first going to show you the combined density or the combined abundance per hectare by each of these surveys, and then we'll get into some species-specific things that focus on some of the top forage species. So in the West Basin, the interagency trawl, we have had a decline in forage base for several years in a row, and right now we're at a pretty low density of forage fishes in general. Much of this is driven by young of year white perch, which make up anywhere from 50 to 75% of our forage base. White perch were the lowest that we've seen in about 15 years or so, thus driving down the overall forage. We did have slight increases in clupeids, so meaning gizzard shad, and also in soft rayed forage. In the Central Basin trawl data, you can see that for the last couple years, we've been at a pretty low forage level, but it's been pretty stable. We did have declines in rainbow smelt, as seen in this navy blue color, but we did have increases in things like white perch and gizzard shad. Moving east, the 2020 results from New York's trawls found a big increase in adult rainbow smelt. Otherwise, we did have some small increases in other soft-rayed fishes and gizzard shad, and had a slight decline in spiny-rayed fishes, but overall, this jump in forage abundance is driven by adult rainbow smelt. Ontario's trawl data from Long Point Bay are indicating that the forage base has been fairly low but pretty steady, kind of like Central Basin. They did have a resurgence in shad somewhat, but rainbow smelt numbers are pretty low, unlike New York data. Moving on to species and age group specific summaries, you can see that for rainbow smelt young of year, or fish that were spawned in that year, in New York surveys, which are in this yellow color here, they've declined quite a bit from a few years prior, but are at a fairly stable level now. And similar is true for the Long Point Bay survey, and they're pretty low in West Basin and Central Basin. Moving on to rainbow smelt adults, you can see across most of the surveys, the numbers of rainbow smelt adults are pretty low, but this really big spike is the New York survey from this past year. This is one of the highest catches that they've ever had of rainbow smelt adults. Now we're looking at emerald shiner trends. So these data are combined adult and young of year emerald shiners. Really for the last 4 to 5 years, we've had minimal catches of emerald shiner, with the one exception here from New York trawl surveys in 2018. Now this might seem pretty concerning because we haven't caught many of them recently, but there's 2 things to keep in mind here. We're looking at bottom trawl data that don't necessarily target or effectively catch emerald shiners like maybe a midwater trawl might. And we also know not just from these data here, but from historical references that emerald shiner populations are volatile, meaning that we can go through periods of very low abundance as seen back around 2009, and then we can seemingly randomly have big spikes in production. Gizzard shad young of year indices rebounded from very low levels observed in 2019 back up to somewhat normal levels for many of the surveys, with the one exception being the West Basin survey that has occasionally seen very big spikes in gizzard shad young of year. Our 2020 catches of round goby, this is across young of year and adult fish, were down somewhat in some of these surveys. So in the East Basin and Long Point Bay surveys, round goby indices were lower than they were in 2019, whereas West Basin and Central Basin trawl data show that they're pretty stable, but really they're stable across surveys. No big changes have been observed for the last couple years. Finally, if we combine all of these trawls into one single indicator and compare it to the time series average shown in this dotted line, you can see that that we've been above it for a few years, but in the last 3 to 4 years, we've really been on a downward trend here. So how concerning is that downward trend? Well, it really depends on the effects on those predator sport fishes. So let's look at diet, growth, and condition for them. So I'll show you some diet data from walleye and lake trout. I'll get into walleye growth, and then we'll go through some lake trout growth indices. Walleye diet data in the East Basin. These are from New York angler caught walleye. In the past, they've shown that they mostly eat rainbow smelt. So you can see in this blue color that makes up well over 50% of their diets in previous years, up until recently where things like gobies and other fishes have been making up a greater proportion of diet. This past year in 2020 is this sliver right here. You can see this is really a return to normalcy. So in 2020, walleyes in the East Basin were eating something like 80–85% rainbow smelt. In the Central Basin, walleye diet is made up of much more gizzard shad as indicated in this red color, and it was no different in 2020. So you can see that about 80% of walleye diet was made up of gizzard shad, and this is according to walleye fall gillnet data. If we look at lake trout diet in the East Basin, this is also from New York data, you can see that it's much the same story as the walleye in the East Basin. So in recent years, they had relied more on round goby here in this red color, but a return to almost 90% makeup of rainbow smelt was seen in 2020. Moving on to growth, here we're looking at walleye length at age for a given age. So age 1 fish down here in blue, age 2 fish in red, and age 3 fish in yellow. For age 1 fish, for the last 7 to 8 years, we've been on a gradual decline, and length at age 1 right now is at a very low level compared to the entire time series here. We don't see the same trend in age 2 and age 3 fish. So we did have a drop here in 2017 and 2018, but these growth metrics seem to be rebounding somewhat, while age 2 here is fairly stable, and age 3 fish are rebounding and are probably around the average for the entire time series. On the east side of the lake, if we go to look at weight at length for walleye, you can see that so these are 20-inch fish down at the bottom in blue, 24-inch fish in red, and 28-inch fish up here at top. You can see that these smaller fish have been pretty stable and were fairly low weight given at a given length for 2018 or so, and have rebounded somewhat since then. And that trend is exacerbated at these larger fish sizes. So 2018 being the minima, and then returning to a higher, maybe near average level. Walleye condition, which is this relative weight at a given length, and this is also by age. So the higher here, essentially the fatter your walleye is at a given length. We reached a really low level in 2018, as you can see here, 2017, and then it's rebounded since then. So in 2020, we're back to near average levels for relative weight. For lake trout, length and weight at age 5, you can see that there's this gradually declining trend for length, but a slight rebound from 2019, whereas for weight, their weight at age 5 has been pretty stable across years. In summary, for our diet, growth, and condition, so here we're looking at relative weights for walleyes down here in the yellow color, and lake trout up here in the red color, compared to their time series means in the dotted lines. You can see that lake trout had a pretty poor year for condition last year, but rebounded back to the time series mean in 2020. And walleye had a few down years in a row for relative weight, but have rebounded back to average. Now, all of this combined is really showing that these fish don't seem to be suffering too much in terms of how fast they're growing or how much they weigh at a given length. And that's an encouraging sign. It's really showing us that despite the fact that our forage fish might be at a very low level, their numbers might still be enough to support plenty of walleye and pretty healthy walleye and lake trout. Now we'll move on to talk some about our hydroacoustic surveys on the lake. We have 3 hydroacoustic surveys, 1 in each of the Lake Erie basins. The East Basin survey predates the other 2 by about 10 years. These surveys monitor trends in forage fish abundance, much like the trawl surveys. In the East Basin and the Central Basin, the hydroacoustic survey is paired with midwater trawls. And so these surveys are able to apportion the density of forage fishes by species. In the West Basin, we don't do midwater trawling, so this is just a total forage fish abundance. These surveys take place simultaneously in the 10 days around the new moon in July. So in 2019, we actually started discussing redesigning the hydroacoustic surveys, and this is for a few different reasons. The original survey designs were never formally evaluated. There was a thought that we could be more efficient, and perhaps we could break the lake into strata that had similar forage fish communities, which might make us more efficient as well. We also noted that the required effort for these surveys was often not completed within a year. And then, of course, we had the unique challenges of the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic that didn't allow the typical survey. So if you look, this is the typical survey design. So you can see in the East Basin over here, we actually had existing strata along with hydroacoustic transects within these strata. So those are the lines that you can see here. And then midwater trawls at each of these points. In the Central Basin over here, we lacked those strata, and this hydroacoustic survey was set up as these very long hydroacoustics pinging transects where we just go straight across the lake. And then they were also paired with midwater trawls. And then in the West Basin, again, we have these long cross-lake transects. And the problem is that if we only have 8 or 10 nights to go out, we have to have pretty good weather to be able to do this. And we have to have the wind coming from the right direction as well to actually hit these cross-lake transects. If we break these cross-lake transects into smaller transects, we could probably get out and sample more and better utilize poor weather. When redesigning these surveys, we went back and looked at the data that we already had. So we broke those long transects back up into EDSUs, which are essentially sampling units that are anywhere from 500 meters to 1 kilometer long. And we looked at how much effort, how many of these EDSUs are required to get under a specified error rate. We also went and defined strata for the Central Basin and for the West Basin using either past hydroacoustic surveys with midwater trawls or bottom trawl information from the West Basin. As an example of how we broke the basins into strata, this is for the Central Basin. We broke the Central Basin into west and east sides and then offshore and inshore components based on species compositions from midwater trawls. So if you look at these graphs, these are showing proportions of catches for different species for west inshore, west offshore, and the same for the east side. And you can turn your focus to this blue line here, which is indicating proportion of emerald shiners. The inshore component of both of these strata, there's much greater emerald shiner catches versus the offshore components here. And then when we broke these down by depth, this is what this ends up looking like. So in the West Central Basin, we have a depth cutoff around 15 meters. And in the East Central Basin, we have a depth cutoff of around 18 meters. We did similar for the West Basin. The West Basin, although was broken up by bottom trawl data and then also by river plumes. And then we further broke these strata up by using the existing grid system. So in the West Basin, we used 5-minute grids, and in the Central and East Basin, we used 10-minute grids to further break up those strata into sampling units. For the West Basin survey in 2020, We didn't attempt any of those cross-basin transects, especially because we weren't allowed to travel across international boundaries, and instead focused on the new survey design. So we randomly drew 10 or 5-minute grids in this case, and then did these much shorter transects that were allowed to, the direction of which was allowed to vary based on wind. You can see we got quite a few transects done in the West Basin. In the Central and East Basins, we were able to do a hybrid approach that combined elements of the old survey and elements of the new survey in order to compare the two. So you can see here in the Central Basin, again, not crossing across international boundaries, but we were able to do some of these long transects that replicate the old survey design that go all the way across the basin, and then also added in randomly drawn 10-minute grid transects. And when we went to compare those, so this is Central Basin comparison for each of those 4 different strata. For the West Offshore, the difference between the old survey, also known as the transect survey, and the new survey, grid survey, the difference between fish densities was significantly different in the West Offshore, but not significantly different in either of the 3 strata. So the initial take of this is that these data are pretty comparable across the old and the new surveys. For the East Basin survey in 2020, we found pretty similar things. So if you look here, these red transects replicate what the old survey or the transect survey would look like. And then these blue lines are indicating randomly drawn 10-minute grid transects. When we went to compare those for 2 different strata here, you can see in strata 2.2, these densities of forage fishes were significantly different, whereas in strata 2.3, they were not significantly different. So this new survey design is showing some promise, but we still need to work on analyzing these data and designing the survey. In terms of hydroacoustic survey results, I'm only going to show you the East Basin survey because that's the most comparable across years. But you can see that in 2020, we had quite a few more adult rainbow smelt size targets in the East Basin versus the last 2 to 3 years. So maybe not that huge increase that we saw from New York trawl surveys, but still an encouraging sign for the adult rainbow smelt population. The last section of the Forage Task Group presentation will be aquatic invasive species. In Lake Erie, grass carp are one of the aquatic invasive species that we focus on. We have an objective of removing 390 grass carp per year that started in 2017. And this graph is showing how many fish we've removed from the lake across all basins in this dotted line here. You can see that we're not meeting that objective of 390 fish. We peaked in 2019 here at around 180 grass carp removed. And then efforts fell off significantly last year, partially because of COVID-19 related restrictions. We still managed to remove around 110 of them last year. This doesn't, of course, include the tagged and released fish that we're studying for movements. The good news with Lake Erie's aquatic invasive species is that we haven't detected any new non-native species in the last year. So this graph is showing Fish and Wildlife Service targeted effort towards early detections. They use electrofishing, trawling, and a variety of different netting methods in order to try and catch invasive species when they first invade a system. As you can see, their efforts have been increasing through 2019, but they were unfortunately not able to get out in 2020 due to the pandemic restrictions. This no new non-native species also includes methods like eDNA, commercial and sport fisheries, and many other sampling programs across the lake. In summary, Forage Task Group reporting for this year. Overall forage fish trends in the West Basin were on the decline and overall pretty low compared to the time series. In the Central Basin, we had stable but still pretty low numbers of forage. Whereas in the East Basin waters, New York saw a big rebound in adult smelt in their trawl surveys, but Long Point Bay did not see a similar trend. They saw stable but still pretty low numbers of forage. However, if we think about some of those predator fish metrics, condition, growth, and diet, we're not really seeing a strong response. We're not seeing really low condition fish. We're not seeing growth plummeting or anything like that. While it might be low, they still seem to be fairly healthy for their given sizes. And therefore, this might indicate that our overall low forage compared to previous time series for our data, that low forage might be more than enough to support the predator fish that we have in the lake. With that, I'd like to thank the members of the Forage Task Group. It's made up of representatives from agencies all across the lake, and also the hydroacoustics redesign team, some of whom are on the Forage Task Group, but many of which are contributing efforts outside of their normal responsibilities. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'll take any questions.